Today we're going to be doing a spring themed watercolor using products from Miss Ink Stamps. Let's get into it right now. For today's card, we're going to be using the Wildflower Stamp Set and coordinating dies. We're going to be doing some watercolor. I'm only going to use the two floral arrangements from the stamp set. We're also going to be using the Leafy Swirls Stencil and the Scalloped Arch Stencil. And again, we're going to be doing some watercolor. I'm going to use my Distress Free Inkers as my watercolors. I've got my water and my paper towel. And I'm going to go ahead and stamp out both of my flower arrangements, the Wildflowers from the stamp set. I'm placing those on a piece of Canson XL Watercolor paper, and I'm going to stamp them in Memento Toffee Crunch ink, because this ink will give me a no-line watercolor look without all the fuss and muss. It will allow me to see the lines and still give that no-line watercolor look. Now, as we get started, I'm only going to do one of each flower for you today. That way it saved time. It took me over an hour to do the card. But what I do is I drop the color where I want it to be the darkest, and then get a thirsty brush. And all that means is that you clean your brush off and pat it off on the paper towel to get most of the water out, and you pull the color out using that brush. So we're going to go around. We're going to skip a petal. I'm using Abandoned Coral right now, and I put that where I want it to be darkest, and I'm going to pull that out to the lightest area of my petal, and then we'll move over a little bit to our next petal in that flower and do the same thing. By doing this allows me to create the shadows I need and the lightness of the color, and it's easier watercoloring than trying to do different kind of washes. This is just one technique for watercolors. You can also drop in a little bit of color in different colors and let the color mix on the paper, as I just did. So we're going to go ahead and finish up our little flower on this one, and then we will move on shortly to one of the other flowers. So I'm going to go ahead, and you can see I'm dropping that in and pulling it out to the lightest area. Now we'll go ahead and start with our pansies. Pansies. I'm going to drop in some seedless preserves and pull that out to the lightest area. That way it gives me that nice gradation. And we will continue that for the rest of those flowers, petals on the flower as well. Now, you do want to skip between petals because watercolor moves where there's water. I've said this before in videos, but if you want to, you don't want to do the petals right next to each other, because it will bleed into the other petal unless you dry them in between, like we're doing right here. I'm going to go ahead and dry those where I can work on the rest of the petals. So I'm going to go ahead and drop it in my color and pull that out. And I did switch brushes. I had a larger brush to begin with, but I went down to a size 2 round brush. That way I had a little bit more control, because the images were a little smaller than I was thinking. And that way I don't have as much water on the brush. Because a round brush will hold water. The bigger the brush is, especially on a round brush, the more water it's going to hold. So by switching to that smaller brush, it allows me not to have as much water on the brush, and I'm able to control it a little bit better in smaller areas. So the size of your brush really does matter. Now for these little flowers, I just kind of dropped in color. I ended up changing my mind several times on what color I wanted them to be, which is no big deal with watercolors, because you can just kind of wet them and pick it up with a paper towel and kind of drop them off. I just kind of dropped in color here and there. I decided I wanted them purple, and then I decided I didn't want them purple. And so it was I just kind of left them and finished them at the end. So I'm going to go ahead. I did leave these in here just so y'all can see. So I'm just going to continue working those for a little bit, and then I've decided just to let them sit, and I'd come back and work on them later. So for the little clover, I decided to make it a mixture of the seedless preserves and the abandoned coral. Give it more of a red-violet look. Yellows are extremely tricky to work with because you don't have a lot of range when you start pulling it out. So again, I'm going to work on that darker area and then pull it out to the lightest. But as I'm saying, with yellow, you have very low values that you can achieve with a yellow color. You have to kind of manipulate it around in different ways. And one way you could do that is by mixing up a the shadow color after it dries with a complementary color and creating a dark, deeper shadow. And I'll show you that in just a little bit. So we're going to go ahead and continue pulling those colors out on the daffodil. And I will just, you can see right there, I dropped the color in the plain water at the end and pulled it down to the color to pull it out. That's another way you can do it. But watercolor does take a little bit of time to get used to. It took me many, many, many years to figure it out. And once I finally did, one day it just clicked. So the more you practice, the better you get at it. Here I'm dropping in that mixture of the darker color, the yellow mixed with the complementary color, which would be seedless preserves here. And it just creates a different shadow color that I can pull out into my shadow areas and kind of give them a little bit more definition and tone to that yellow. It's a super tricky color to work with. You really have to take your time and be patient with it. Now, for the little, I think they're supposed to be bluebells or lilies of the valley. I really don't know. I decided to make them orange to go with my color palette that I picked out. So I'm going to do that same process of pulling the color out to the lightest color. But I thought they turned out super pretty. And once everything's completely dry, you can come back in and add a second coat, a second layer of your colors if you want to. That's what I did on some of the flowers. For the centers, I just dropped in the yellow and pulled them out just a little bit so that there was a different value in there. And here you can see me adding another layer of that color and doing the same process, pulling out, making it a little bit darker. That's another thing you want to do with your watercolors is do a second. Sometimes you even have to do three or four coats of colors to get where you want it to be. So don't be afraid to go back over your watercolors to make them a little bit more intense after they are completely dry. Let me preference that. You want to make sure they are completely dry before you do that. See, I waited until the petals of the daffodil were dry before I came back in and started adding my center. And I just chose the orange. I used the carved pumpkin distress ink for that. This is what I used for the orange. The yellow was abandoned wild honey. I'm sorry. I used, so back to the card for a second. I'm just coming in and doing that same process with the center. I'm going to put in the color right there. And I came back and as it was drying and added more color to make it intenser. And more intense in the center of the flower where it would be darker naturally. Now for the leaves of this in the stems, I came in with crushed olive to begin with, and I'm pulling that out. And what I'm going to do very, very shortly, I will show you what I'm going to do in the shadow area in just a minute. I'm pulling this all the way out as far as I can get it to go. That way I can get a nice varied amount of tone in the color. And I'm going to drop in a little bit more color, pull it out, and keep it nice and light. So I'm going to keep going around, and I'm going to do this last stem over here. And then I'm going to grab a mixture. I'm going to add a different green into this while it's still wet. I'm going to come in and drop in evergreen bough that way, and evergreen bough and crushed olive mix really pretty together, and I make this beautiful natural green color that is just really outstanding. You can see it here where I'm dropping it in the darkest areas. It just gives that real pretty naturally springy kind of green, and you do have to be a little careful with it because it does get a little intense there, so you have to be super careful when you're pulling out. But you can see how the size, I hope you can see how the size of the brush really helps to control the amount of water you have. That way you have a better control of your pigment. Now, even though I'm using distress reinkers as watercolors, I do the same process using my regular watercolors. I'll start in the darkest area and pull them out to the lightest area. It's just how I learned how to watercolor. I'm going to go ahead and do this stem, and then we're going to move on to our next set of stems and leaves. So I'm going to drop in the color here, and I will go ahead and tell you, a little surprise, that depending on which color you put down first before you layer another color on top of it, it will change the look of the color that you're doing completely. So because that crushed olive has more green in it, has more yellow in it, it's going to really, when I add the evergreen bough on top of it, it really gives a different look than if I were to do the evergreen bough first and then drop in some of the crushed olive. It's just how color works, y'all. I don't know how to explain it to y'all. But you can see, like right there where I just dropped in that color, how that beautiful summery, springy green looks. So this time on these petals, I'm starting with evergreen bough, and I'm going to pull it out. And evergreen bough is more of a bluish teal color, darker teal. You can see I dropped in that crushed olive there, and you can see the difference it looks between the two colors by adding the one color first and then dropping the other color on top of it. It looks completely different. You would never guess those were the same colors. But I used those same colors in each of the leaves in some way, shape, or form. So I'm just going to go ahead and keep pulling those out. And these later, I decided I wanted them to be more of the bluish green instead of the greenish green. So that's why I came back in and added that first. Now, for our daffodil, we're going to come in. I'm actually going to end up mixing a color. And what I did was I mixed evergreen bough and some of the crushed olive equally on my palette, and then created my own shade of green. Depending on how you mix something, you can create different values and tones by just mixing colors. You do want to be careful when you do that, because if you mix the complementary colors, you're going to get a natural brown. Basically, is what you're going to get. And if you add, just a little hint, if you add white to a complementary color mixed together, you're going to get what we call a natural gray. So we're going to go ahead and continue painting our leaves on our dandelion. Daffodil. I can't think of what flower we're painting. Anyway, we're going to go ahead and finish painting our leaves here, and then we'll work on our stem, and we will move right along to working on the rest of our card. So we're going to come in now. Okay, right here. See where I put that shadow first and pulled it out, because I wanted that to be the darker, because of how it's bent over on the flower, or on the stem or leaf. That way it gives me an easier way to do that. Now, sometimes you do have to do negative painting, where you're painting around objects to get to the area that you're wanting it, the color to go. Like right here, we did negative painting first. And that just is a fancy way of saying you're going around something. That's all it really boils down to. So I'm going to drop in my color right there and pull it out to the lightest color. And we have a completely different flower, or different color than the color across from it. Still harmonious because they're made with the same colors, but they look quite different. All right, I'm going to go ahead and do the stem. And I'm going to put the shadow in first and then pull it out to the center. And just by that thirsty brush, remember you always want to have a paper towel close by just in case. Then we're going to add some of the crushed olive on this side to balance everything out, because that's going to keep our designs nice and harmonious. So we'll just drop in that color over here, and then we will add in a little bit more to finish up the rest of the leaves. So I'm just going to pull those out and keep painting this until we get there. Now, see, I've added some shadow there. Now I've got everything nice and painted. I'm finishing up, and I'm going to go ahead and finish up my little shadows back there, and then I will let this dry, and then I will end up cutting it out with its matching dye. While that's drying, I'm going to go ahead and work on the background of my card. So I'm going to start off by using the largest of the Scalloped arch stencils, and I'm going to ink blend with some tumbled glass, and I think it was tumbled glass and broken china is what I'm using around the edge of the stencil to create my focal panel for the background. So we're just going to ink blend around that. I started with the lightest color and then came in with the broken china around the edges just to have a little bit of contrast. And we're going to come around the top. I'm also going to add a little bit more color in there as well in a little bit. Now I'm going to take that Leafy stencil, Leafy Swirl stencil, and I'm going to tape it into place, because we're laying a stencil on top of another stencil. And this is going to help give me a background that is florally. So we're just ink blending with that broken china right on top of our stencil. And kind of letting certain spots get a little bit more, some a little bit less. That way everything's nice and there's different values back there. There's that. And I'm going to come in with a little coffee crunch around the top left and to bottom right, just to add a little bit more color back there. And I can remove the stencil and go ahead and pull that out. And now I can arrange my focal panel. So I'm kind of just going around and placing them where I think I want them to be, and to kind of get an idea of where my sentiment can go, because I wanted to give it enough room. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp that down in VersaFine Onyx Black, and then I can take that out, and I'm going to end up trimming that down just a little bit, because that way it helps me keep it nice and centered. And I did want it to be a little matte around the card from the card base. So we're just cutting 1/4 of an inch off of each, or 1/8 of an inch off of each side to trim it down to 4 by 5 1/4. And then I'm going to add foam tape behind my panel. I'm going to use some wide 1-inch, 1mm foam tape. And I'll just add in a few strips on the back. And we will attach this to our card front. After we get everything nice and adhere, I'll go ahead and set foam tape behind our focal images as well. And I can go ahead and start removing all of the backings from those pieces of foam tape. And we will add a little bit of liquid glue on the back so we have a little wiggle room of each piece so that I can have time to get everything nice and lined up. I did stand up to make sure everything was nice and centered when I put the card front onto the card base. And I will peel off all those backings for the focal images. And we will add liquid glue behind. And I'm going to offset them slightly, making sure they're nice and tucked up right as close to the sentiment as possible. I did have to trim down this little piece of foam tape right there. It was sticking out too much. So we're just going to kind of sandwich that right in there. And then we'll do our other side and add that with some liquid glue and foam tape. And we'll tuck that right in there to make sure nothing, our sentiment is not covered up. And then I can take and trim off any excess that's overhanging from the back. So I'll just move all that scrap out of the way. And then I'm going to open up the card and take my long handle scissors and trim off the excess. That way I have nice and smooth, clean edges. And then I'm going to take my white gel pen and come in and add the finishing touches where it gives it a little bit more life. To me, this is one step that is super critical in card making because it can take your card from blah to wow. And you're like, some people will wonder, why does that look different? What makes that so stand out? Usually it's the little details you put in, like your white gel pen highlights, your Stardust stickles, to add a little glitter here and there. That takes your card from blah to wow. And just a little bit of detail can really help do that. And by adding back in our natural highlights with our gel pen, that really gives that gives you that hint of contrast in your design, which is a key element. So you're going to take and add those gel pen highlights. I like to add them probably a little more than I should. But we're just going to keep going around, adding them to each of the flowers where they should be, where the light would be hitting. And we will take and finish that up just a second here. I'm just going to add a couple more and a couple more over here, one right there. Especially where anything's bent over, there's going to be a highlight hitting it because of how I colored it. So that's why I like to go ahead and hit the stems as well. So I'm going to go ahead and finish adding in my little highlights. And then I'm going to come in and add some gem stickers. I did add a little extra adhesive on there just because I don't trust gem stickers that much. But I found some that were really close in colors for what I used. So I'm adding some yellow, some pink, and a little green. And then I'm going to add some to each of the centers of my flowers that have the little centers to add a little bit of sparkle to those. I chose to just use the white one, or the yellow ones. And the, I think they're like a copperish color, but they're really not copperish. It's like a super light brown. but they went well with the center of the flowers, so that's why I used them. Here's a closer look at the card, and here's some more pictures. If you like this video, you're probably going to like the one coming up next. See you in the next video. Bye, guys. Stay crafty. Love you.